Meeting of the Montpelier-Roxbury Board of School Directors at 6:31, January 3rd, 2024. Before the meeting starts, I do want to say that Emma, unfortunately, is stepping down. We're going to miss her very much. And thank you for all your great work. And they're going to be with us through February 7th. But I do want to put word out that basically with the timing of the that will be up for election on town meeting day. So if any member of the public is interested, please get in touch with Libby, Mia, or me, and we can help guide you on that. But you will need to get on the ballot, and that will require getting 30 signatures from your community members. And I'm not quite sure of the deadline, but in the past, it's been right around the end of January. So if you're interested, let us know. There's not a ton of signatures, but you will need to get on. And I think given the timing, we will probably not seek to appoint someone and just have the public take care of it, because is that our final meeting before town meeting day, or we have
That'll be one more.
Yeah, we have one more. Yeah, so that process is out there. Again, get in touch with Libby, me, or me. All of our emails are on the website, and we look forward to having me or Emma for the next 3 meetings, right?
And while we're on that subject,
Yes.
it looks like Mia, you're up. Jake, you're up. Scott is up and Kristen is up for re-election.
Those seats.
Or making decisions.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
So anybody who would be interested in those needs to get that paperwork in by the end of January.
exactly.
It's like the last Monday in January.
It's some number of days before town meeting day, but
I think it's like the 5 Mondays before town meeting day or something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
So that's kind of soon.
So
kind of soon. Yeah.
and in Montpelier, John Odom, the city clerk, can help you out with all that.
And I think there's a form on the website that you can
Mhm.
print out. In fact, I know there is, because I've used it. Yeah, no, and you can have friends, family members help you with signatures, and people can sign multiple documents.
Petitions.
Petitions,
Yeah, to put
yes.
somebody on the ballot.
I just want to put it out there too, that I'm personally willing to help people if you're collecting signatures. I'm very good at collecting signatures. So if somebody's interested in running, email me and I will walk around my neighborhood. I think I got 30 in like an hour one time,
Here, Emma.
which is what you need. I think it's 30.
Yeah, no, it is 30. And I also suggest getting maybe a few more than that, just in case, someone signed it who's no longer on the voting roll, who,
Yeah.
you
And he has to be able to read it or it doesn't count, so
has to be what?
legible.
Yeah. Yeah. So a few extra just to make sure is always.
Get 40 signatures.
And if
Yeah,
anybody from Roxbury is listening or is interested, the contact is Tammy Legacy, who's our town clerk.
And we're hoping you're one of the interested, Kristen.
She's just nodding.
Yes. Okay, good. We like nods. So first call to order, public comment. We're going to have 2 public comments again as part of the budget process. This initial one, and then we're going to have one after our third draft of fiscal year 2025 budget presentation. So you're welcome to speak at both, but just for people who want to speak, you will have 2 opportunities. And I just want to reiterate that public comment is a listening time for the board. We do not respond in real time. However, it's obviously a very important part of our decision-making process. We do listen very carefully. We do take into account everything we hear. And I also just want to acknowledge that, it can oftentimes be somewhat difficult to speak in front of a board like this, both because it's public speaking, which not everyone is comfortable with, and also some of the issues people bring to our attention can be difficult. So we really appreciate the feedback. You can also email the board at schoolboard@mpsvt.org. And that is another great way to send us your thoughts. And also in a slightly less real-time public manner. So do I have anyone who would like to speak a public comment? Let's start in the room. Any hands? And let's go to the Zoom. If anyone would like to speak, there's a raise hand function. It's if the reactions button, if you hover over it, a little raise hand comes up. Otherwise, if you don't know where that is, you can just go on camera and give us a wave. Looks like at this time, no. So again, we'll have public comment after the budget presentation. Next order of business is the consent agenda. The consent agenda are items that generally require no real board discussion or deep consideration, things like approval of the minutes, etc. And that helps us do business a little more efficiently. And if there is something that a board member wants to discuss in more depth, they can pull it off of the consent agenda item as part of a motion to approve the consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I move to approve the consent agenda.
Do I have a second?
A second.
Any discussion or questions? All's in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Christina and Libby, take it away.
Oops.
And again, before you start, I just want to thank you for all the fantastic work you've done over the past couple months on these budget presentations. I know it's been a tough year and a lot of numbers to crunch, and we really appreciate the very, very hard work you've done explaining this to us all and getting us to a point where we can process it and make a decision in a couple weeks.
Sorry.
Well, the numbers.
Is this a class for raging alcoholics?
That's not.
Yeah.
They're raging alcohol today.
Our first Zoom bomber.
That's what it was. Okay, so here's our third draft. We do have, let me put it up for the whole thing. We do have the lengthy budget presentation that was presented a few board meetings ago with our strategic plans and links to all their documents and websites and all that kind of stuff, which I think we'll just glaze through today. Yes, sound good? Because we've gone through that at length at a separate time and it hasn't changed at all. So we can get to the budget stuff. So here's just some district information and demographics. Our context still is that we want to support our theory of growth while being sensitive to the tax implications of our community. And the statewide factors, as we've been talking about, we have Act 127, which is a new pupil weighting, and it has a variety of implications on our budget. The anticipated dollar yield is $9,452, and keeping in mind that that is voted on by the legislature in May, so that will remain anticipated for the entire budget season. The common level appraisal has come in because I think it's changed on there. So the common level appraisal has come in, so the board will see new numbers for the CLA. In this budget, our health rates have increased 16.4% across the state. That's not just an MRPS thing. That's a statewide factor. But for MRPS, that equates to almost $400,000 increase to our budget. And then local factors we do have decreasing student enrollment. The district drivers, just the board's focus is academic achievement for all students, safety, inclusion, and belonging for every member of our community, and a commitment to open communication with the community. This is where I'm going to kind of glaze through it because the board has seen this before. They haven't changed from previous presentations that we've done. Here's all of the big pieces for staffing, professional development, and leadership for each of our 4 tiers, with links to work definitions, curriculum sites, assessment sites that are now public on our website after a whole lot of good work from our central office team. And the budget. Here's our glossary of terms. So it's nearly impossible to talk about the budget without using some of these terms, and many of them are very confusing and hard to understand. Even for myself, in my sixth year as superintendent, it's still kind of hard for me to explain what the dollar yield actually is. So if you're caught up on terms, kind of pull this out of the packet or keep this bookmarked for yourself so that you have these, this lingo. The big ones that affect our budget are our general fund or education spending. That's what we are in control of as a district, is our education spending, most of it. The long-term weighted average daily membership is what used to be the equalized pupils. It's now in Act 127, that big long term that we will just refer to as LTW, or we'll probably refer it back to weighted pupils. The dollar yield is trying to make everything equal $1 and generate enough money for the ed fund. So the rule of thumb is that when the education fund is really flush and we're in a really good economy, that's a higher yield. That means lower tax rates. And if the economy is not as good, or the education fund is lower and not quite as flush, that means a lower yield and higher tax rates. And this is set by law. We do not have any control over this. And then, of course, the common level of appraisal, or CLA, and it's your market value of your house compared to what the appraised value is for the property. We want it as close to 100% as possible or over. And if once it starts dipping below that, then our taxes start to increase. I do okay on those terms, Christina? Budget unknowns at this point in time, we still don't have a final long-term weighted ADM or equalized pupils. We've gotten 3 different versions in the last 4 different versions in the last 2 days.
Oh.
2 of them came yesterday, an hour apart from each other. So I think we think we have a final number, but we're not. Nobody's sure. That's a number that the Agency of Education comes to us. We actually do know the CLA at this point, that should be taken out as the budget unknowns. Our transportation aid, we're still waiting on, and we're in contract negotiations with one of our, is AFSCME. All right, Christina, take it away.
Okay.
You all have seen the budget at a glance. I'm going to go over this real quick. The first column is the FY24 final budget after the yield was set and CLA was adjusted for reappraisal. So that was what folks paid taxes on this current year. You can see the calculation of each line to the far left. You'll see that we're adding the general budget to the capital plan equals the total budget. So you can follow down throughout the column. The next green section is FY24 budget if Act 127 were in place. So this is what we're comparing to for the FY25 budget. And this is our third draft. The general budget has not changed at all. Neither has the capital plan from previous versions. So our total budget is 32 million. And our net tax revenues, so these are other revenues like tuition and interest and grants and that sort of thing. So you can reduce your total budget by those revenues. So your ed spending is 26 million. And this is an updated pupil count.
Okay, raise your hand if you really give a shit about.
And on that, go ahead,
Yeah.
Christina.
Thank you, Anna.
And on that.
Control muting.
All right, so our pupil count went up as of, 3 o'clock yesterday, 1,835.93. So that's giving us our ed spending per long-term weighted average daily membership of 14,549. And currently the property dollar yield is set at 9,452. And because we're capped at 5%, the residential tax rate will be $1.33. These CLAs changed. Montpelier
Well, that sucks, doesn't it?
So Montpelier's CLA, we were using 100% and went up 100.18%. And Roxbury is decreased to 94.51. think you're up for the next few slides, Libby.
Here are our enrollment projections for MHS, MSMS, and UES. Okay. It does show, if you looked way down at the bottom, K through 12, that we are decreasing. We're modeled to continue to decrease, but it's a gradual decrease. It's not a precipitous decrease. Here's our class size estimates for the MHS, MSMS, and UES. So where we are right now is we have 5 teachers at the grade 4 level, and we are suggesting reduction in force in our.
Shut the hell up.
Level for teachers. The numbers to the right for 24-25 and 25-26 are shaded in yellow simply because we're watching closely our class sizes at Union Elementary School as potential reductions later on. And then here are our enrollment projections for Roxbury. The difference between projections from the Montpelier schools and Roxbury, particularly at the elementary school, Union School, is that there's a person who does modeling based on childbirth rates in Montpelier. That type of modeling doesn't happen in Roxbury, probably because of the population size. So there's no scientific rhyme or reason to where these numbers are going, except for the class goes down to the next level the next year. Here's just our graphs. The board sees this type of graph every year, so you can see kind of historical trends from our population or our enrollment, sorry. So this is what this particular budget has as an overview. We've had to add in 2.55 interventionists. That was primarily due to the loss of ESSER funding, which was federal grant funding over the last few years from COVID. We are adding an Roxbury after school program, 1.5 FTE. This is an add to our budget, but we're hoping to offset it with revenue. Currently, these positions are funded by a grant that will not be available to us next year. Social worker has been being paid for through Medicaid fund balance, but because we've done a good job of paying down that fund balance through this work, paying the social worker, we need to move this now into our local budget. And there's a new payroll tax for the childcare tax that's 0.44%. That's going to be added. The district will be paying that. That's added onto every employee's paycheck, and the district is paying that. In terms of reduction of force, we're suggesting an AFSCME support staff position of 1.0 FTE, a K-6 licensure, 1.0 FTE for low enrollment, RVS pre-K, 0.5 FTE for low enrollment, the RVS library media, the technology piece of that job, which is 0.2 FTE, and an MHS science district wide sustainability, which is 0.2 FTE. As far as the expenses by school, I mentioned this before in the first time that we went through this longer budget presentation, but I think it's important to say again. As far as the union cost increasing, we believe that in future years, there's room to come more in line with our class size policy. At Union, we have very low class sizes right now, or will have low class size in the next few years at Union. So there's room to bring that cost down because of our class sizes, which we'll be getting to around 12 and 13 in a class, and it's way below our class size policy. There is not as much wiggle room at Roxbury. So that number won't be doing anything but going up in the future because we can't reduce any force in Roxbury after the 0.2 for the technology position. Every other person is needed. And then you want to do the highlights for the expenses and the revenues. Christina?
So there's two different ways you can look at our expenses. And this is by program. So looking at general education, special education, things like library, school board. There's a common theme on the increases here, which is health insurance and where we landed with negotiations. And the added positions that Libby mentioned earlier. Nothing has changed since the last two board meetings. So we're looking at an 11.9% increase in our expenses. The next two slides are just looking at it a little differently. So you can see the percentages of your total budget and where they end up. And the next slide is a year-to-year comparison. You can see a big jump in special education. We were expecting that, so we planned for that. Expenses by category. This is where you can see the breakout on salaries and benefits, professional services and contracted services. There hasn't been any, this again will show the 11.9% increase in our overall expenses. And on the pie chart, yep, you'll see how it's broken out there with salaries and benefits. And the next slide, you'll be able to see where the benefits really kind of spike up from this current year. Revenues. Again, nothing's changed on the revenue side since I've met with you last. We did compare our special education expenses to the revenues, the offsetting revenues that we'll be receiving. And most of these at the bottom, those are all matching the grant expenses. So those are all reimbursable grants. So whatever we spend, we get dollar for dollar back. So that's like IDEA, Title I, Title II. This just demonstrates your revenues. The capital plan, I met with Andrew and he put together what we should be focusing on for the capital plan in FY25. So he'd like to look at the US window replacements and the Main Street window replacements and also some roof repairs district-wide.
Mainly here at the high school.
I'm sorry?
Mainly here at the high school.
Yeah, over the cafeteria. And what everybody wants to know is the tax rates. This was an earlier slide, but I'll go back through it. So this draft, I'm going to focus on the gray area, the gray column. So this draft of the budget is an increase of 11.9%. The long-term weighted average daily membership is calculated at 1,835.93. So that did increase from the last time I met with you. They're still working out ELL students. They found us some students in our data that we had submitted quite a while ago. So that was good. That decreases our ed spending per pupil. I'm going to keep that short. And again, you'll see the capped rate is $1.33. And the updated CLAs get Montpelier tax rate to $1.33 and Roxbury $1.41. The next slide will demonstrate if you own a $200,000 house in Montpelier, what you can anticipate your tax bill to be. It's going to be an increase from this current year of $430. For a $300,000 house, it's going to be an increase of $645. And for a $400,000 house, it'll be an increase of $860. In Roxbury, same house values will be $221, $331, and $441. The next slide demonstrates the tax rate history from FY21. So you can see it with the CLA and before the CLA. The next slide is the non-residential tax rate calculation. So our budget does not affect this tax rate, just the CLA does. And this is on properties like second homes, rental properties, commercial properties, and that.
So we have been playing around with 5-year with assumptions. This was something the board asked to try to play with a little bit more. So we did 3 different assumptions. And I just want to really reiterate the word assumption. None of this is true. So we need to just keep that in mind. Some of it are good guesses and others are just, let's see what would happen if this happened. So just keeping this in mind that these are assumptions for the 5-year trajectory of 127 with the 5% cap in place in the law. So just to remind people that 127 starts this year, is effective this year, and there's a 5% cap on equalized tax rates. That's your tax rate prior to CLA being calculated in. And so that's a given number. We know what that's going to be for the next 5 years. We don't know what it will be with the CLA because the CLA changes. But we know what the equalized tax rate will be for the next 5 years because it's capped as long as we reach that 5% threshold. What we don't know is what will happen in FY30. So we were asked to make some assumptions to take a guess as to what would happen to tax rates in FY30 with certain trajectories. So assumption 1, we made the assumption that our general budget would increase, or our education spending would increase by $2 million a year. We made the assumption that we would lose 15 long-term weighted ADM per year, which is that's actually probably a pretty good guess, but who really knows? But that's why that one is kind of solid for each of these assumptions because it's a reasonable guess. We're assuming that the dollar yield will fall $500 per year. So that puts our potential with those assumptions in place. It puts our potential equalized tax rate increase before the CLA is calculated from year FY29 to FY30 as at $3.01, which would be a 47% increase in 1 year with these assumptions. If we were to put that in with the CLA, and we can assume based on past averages that the CLA could drop approximately 3% per year because we're not up for reappraisal. So it will continue to either stay the same or drop, most likely. Then that has the tax rate when we're going from FY29 to FY30 at $3.54, which is a 55% increase with these assumptions in place. What? In 5 years, yeah. Well, from 29 to 30. That's 1 year. So, go ahead, Jake.
Is this starting from $1?
Yeah.
33?
Yeah. So you'd see on the next slide the projections, how it's going to increase. So the green is the cap rate.
Okay, so the percent increase is just in that final year?
Yeah,
The
just that
170.
final year.
It looked like it was
Okay.
170 in FY29 you had on there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So the final,
to 470 on assumption. Nope, sorry,
No,
that's assumption 2.
that's-
$3.01.
Yep.
On assumption 1.
so that's where the percentage difference comes in. Assumption 2, still going with a $2 million increase in our general budget, still losing 15 long-term weighted average daily membership per year, which is per pupil. But then we played with the dollar yield a little bit. And this is significant because you can see how much the dollar yield could impact things. And this is a number we do not have control over. So if over the next course 5 years, the dollar yield decreases by 1,000 each year, which is a lot. That's a lot. That would not be good if that happened for anybody in the state. Then the potential equalized tax rate increase pre-CLA from fiscal year 29 to fiscal year 30 would be $4.70, or we'd go up to $4.70, which would be a 56% increase. And the potential tax rate after the CLA would be $5.53, which would be a potential 70% increase. With assumption 3, that's significant. That's just showing you how much the dollar yield in and of itself influences tax rates, which of course is set by the legislature, just based on the economy and the money in the education fund. Assumption 3, we made the assumption of getting right to the 10%, under the 10% for long-term weighted average daily membership, which is where we need to be, so we don't have a tax review from the magical tax review committee at the Agency of Education. Assuming a $500,000 increase per year, losing 15 long-term weighted ADMs, the dollar yield falling $500 a year, then the potential equalized tax rate increase pre-CLA from FY29 to FY30 would be 32%. So our tax rate would go up to 2.40. And after CLA, it would be $2.82, which is a 43% increase. So these assumptions you can see on a line graph. Starting from FY24, FY25, the green line again is our capped amount. So this is the equalized tax rates. It's not before CLA, it's the equalized tax rates. Or I'm sorry, it is before CLA, sorry. That is our capped amount. So the capped amount in FY29 will be $1.70. That's what it will be if we can stay capped. And so you can see that the assumption 1 is a $3.01 and goes up to $3.01 in FY30. With assumption 2, it goes, and that's the one where the dollar yield's so low, it goes up to a $4.70 equalized tax rate. And with assumption 3, which is a less decrease of the dollar yield and less increase to our budget, it's a $2.40 tax rate. And just keeping in mind that these are assumptions, this is not reality. Nobody can paint what this is. Actually, these are just assumptions to show a potential 5-year impact and why the administration has been talking about the necessity of bringing down our general budget, because that is what we have control over. We don't want to have to do that in 1 year. So we're up for discussion. And just a reminder, the upcoming meetings, the next board meeting will need to be an approval of a budget from the board. And March 5th is the budget informational meeting on town meeting day.
Quick question. Is the presentation you just gave, is it in the materials on the website?
I'm sure it will be as soon as Anna puts it on there.
Okay. I think it would be helpful because we have so many folks watching from home, if they could have the chance to basically thumb through it like the folks in the room can.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Thank you, Anna.
If she hasn't already, she may have done it this afternoon.
Yeah, and we have a whole section on the website with budget information. Questions, discussion, comments? Jake?
I think that this is really valuable. And
Pointing at the line graph right now.
the colorful line graph. It's hard to do, hard to know what's going to happen, but I think this is like a really valiant best guess.
They are guesses. And
Yes.
that's the important thing to say. They are guesses.
But yeah, I think it's great work. So thank you.
Yeah, no, just want to reiterate that they are guesses, and I think they also, show the predicament we're in, and that being cautious is prudent. Rhett and then Kristen.
Yeah, it's the, I want to confirm whether my understanding is correct. When we talk about the cost per pupil at each school on page 20 of the presentation, and then we look at the, like the budget at a glance one, the difference is this number is based on our actual number of kids, and the budget at a glance is based on the long-term weighted average daily membership or in the past.
You are correct. Yes.
Okay.
Actual kids in seats.
I just,
I know. I
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
I
a lot of
know.
numbers.
I know.
Yeah. Kristen,
I just have a question about the Benson's chart in terms of the potential residential tax rate. So that's calculated for Montpelier based on a 3% CLA drop. Do we know those? Did we calculate those for Roxbury and what that would look like?
I didn't do that with Roxbury's. I just did it with Montpelier's.
Okay. So why assume a CLA drop of 3%? Is that just again sort of like a guess, or is that kind of an average?
It's looking back at kind of what has happened over the last few years. So it's a guess, but it's based, I went back into budgets and looked. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't do Roxbury's, because Roxbury's isn't as typical.
How so?
Sometimes the Roxbury CLA stays the same. Sometimes it drops. Sometimes it's a surprise. Like it's not as typical as like the Montpelier CLA.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not sure why, but
Because the CLA is basically done via an appraisal that happens every 10 years, correct? So
Jake's shaking his head, no.
no,
6 years.
The CLA changes every year.
Yeah.
And it's like how the fair market value of property in the town has changed since your last reappraisal. So every year it's moving a little bit different.
But the reappraisal process for the
It's
town.
10 years.
6 to 10
And
years.
then that gets us.
Yeah.
Maybe to 100%, right?
Hopefully, yeah.
For a year or two.
the CLA, there's been less kind of variation over time
Yeah.
throughout the years at Roxbury. So
Yeah.
there's less inclination to look at that. Okay.
Other questions or comments?
Jill has a question.
Oh, Jill, oh, sorry.
Oh, good. I can unmute. No, I was just going to articulate the CLA for towns that have so much fewer parcels that change hands every year, like Roxbury, is much more volatile. It's literally just a numbers. This is my day job. So when you have a really small town, you might have, 100 property sales per year. That means that the change year over year is pretty big, or, can be pretty volatile. Whereas I don't know exactly how many parcels there are in Montpelier, but it's a larger pool of sales to choose from. So it can be pretty consistent that the CLA changes year over year. That's all.
Thank you, Jill. Emma.
I want to reiterate the thanks that Jake gave to Libby and also to Mia, that they spent quite a bit of time over their winter vacation crunching these numbers. And I do think it's really valuable, and it's helpful for me to understand what's likely, sort of the cliff that we keep referring to, what's likely to happen. And so these numbers have really helped me understand that. It doesn't make me feel any better about what, it makes me feel like our community has a lot of work to do to, lobby our legislators to change what this cliff looks like, because it feels not plausible that people can afford these types of increases in the year 2030. It's enough to know that we're facing 5% increases every year, but then to look at the numbers in 2030. And then I started thinking about 2031 and 2032 and, getting away from myself. But so I did have a point of clarification. It was about the percent increase in the assumptions. So listed on this slide.
What page?
I don't have page numbers on this. Oh, 35, I think. So for example, the assumption 2, the potential residential tax rate for Montpelier increase is $5.53. That's listed as a 70% increase from what number?
From $1.70.
And so $5.53 is a 70% increase to $1.70.
I think so, that's right.
Well, but it was is the $1.70, but the $1.70 is pre-CLA and this is after
Oh, yeah,
CLA.
that's
Does
right.
that
Thank
matter?
Thank you. Yes.
I still
Sorry,
think
thank you.
there's something funny there. It's $1.70 the year before,
Pre-CLA.
and then
Right,
it goes to $4.70 pre-CLA, so that
Right.
would be a massive percent increase, not 40 something.
Right, it seems like more like a 300%.
Oh, yeah. My math could be off on those percentages. Christina didn't check me. She's like, I know it. I can
it's
see
just like,
it.
you should have let me
The
check
reason
that.
I should have
Check this. Sorry about that.
The reason why it stood out is because like Mia had helped me sort of with some, looking at more of the raw data and in that raw data, that number, the tax rate impact in 2030 can potentially be like a 300% increase to the actual tax money that I pay out as a taxpayer homeowner in Montpelier. And that's a really shocking number.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, 70% is shocking
Yeah.
enough. But
I think-
300% is.
I think putting the percentages aside, and I apologize if I made the math mistake, it's totally mine and I didn't have my business manager check it. Is that regardless, any of those assumptions, the tax impact in FY 30 is large, right? Even if we're very conservative over the next 5 years, the tax impact is going to be large if nothing else happens. And so that's what we all need to work on for the next 5 years. Like, that's what we're trying to get across by saying this isn't a 1-year dilemma or challenge to the school board in the district. It's a 5-year challenge to the school board in the district.
And I think it's worth pointing out that it's probably going to be sizable, even if the legislature does do something, because I think a fix likely to come from the legislature is probably one that's gonna push that trajectory downward. It's not probably gonna put us on where we.
We will not be returning to historical tax rates. It's my hunch.
Right, but just, that was a very sobering moment to look at those numbers and see, like, I've been sort of feeling like, okay, well, we can all sort of band together and do our best, but a 300% increase is sort of like, feels insurmountable for this board to, over the next 5 years, to sort of whittle away, hundreds of thousands at a time to a 300%.
Yeah, and keeping in mind, that's with the dollar yield dropping 1,000 a year,
Mhm.
right? Like, that's bonkers, to put a professional word to it. Like, I don't know if that would actually happen,
Right,
but it's an exercise in showing how much the dollar yield impacts the tax
Yeah.
rate with that. And we don't have any influence on the dollar yield.
mhm.
I think that's more showing that than anything else. Jake would probably be able to say, or Jill better than I, but I think $1,000 decrease per year for the next 5 years in the dollar yield would be a very sorry state for the state of Vermont in education.
I mean, we know we have some time, some years ahead of us to sort of plan and be ready for this, but I think that it feels like something that actually needs to, like, it doesn't seem realistic for the taxpayers to shoulder that burden. And so it does feel like something needs to change. And I just think, I don't want to be alarmist, but I do think the community needs to start paying attention to the legislature and what's happening around these changes. And that was sort of my takeaway from these assumptions. I did have another question. Can I keep going?
Yeah,
Or
go for it.
so I just want to return to a sentiment that Scott brought up at the last meeting, which I keep coming back to and agree with, is just like getting a little bit closer to that 10% in this first year while we're still wrapping our brains around what's going to look like. Is there any chance of sort of, the biggest thing that keeps coming up as a question is that 0.2 position, but is there any way to sort of level out the cuts a little bit differently and not be at an 8 point, I think we're at 8.48 and maybe get closer to like 9.4? Is there
The
any?
only thing I would respond with is the more you add this year, the more you'll have to take it out eventually.
Mhm.
You're gonna have to find places to take it out eventually.
Yeah, if the law doesn't change and if things don't change dramatically,
Right.
which I think they need to.
No, and I completely agree with that, Emma, but I mean, even if the legislature steps in and says stabilizes the yield, so it stays relatively constant and doesn't drop. We're still like kind of on a path of cutting. We're still probably at a place where not to have a major spike in taxes in 29-30, we're going to have to pair. We're going to have to be restrictive in what we spend on. I mean, I think the legislature could make a lot of changes and it would take some of these like draconian things off the table, but it wouldn't put us in. We can go up to 10 because because it's year one. I mean, I think, yeah, as Libby was saying, we're going to have to, we're going to have to make these choices in year one or in year 3 or in year 4 or year 5.
Jake's got some.
I think another possibility at the state level is that the legislature takes another look at the 5% cap and might actually increase it, which is not a good thing. So like instead of 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 for the next 5 years, it could be 5, 7.5, 10, 12.5, something like that, which would be punitive to us. It would be bad. I think that's a possibility. As far as budget development, I think Mia's idea from a couple weeks ago makes a lot of sense, if I understood it correctly, is of our reserve amount or surplus or whatever it's called, I can't remember. Fund balance. We might potentially want to use as little of that as possible to get up near the 10%. And so that we have it later on.
To use it later.
Yeah.
Because right now we're planning on taking 165? 165 more than we had originally budgeted for, is that right? 565? Right.
That would most definitely be one strategy that we should probably consider over the next 5 years so that we can have that FY30 and beyond. Thinking about how we can continue to help taxpayers using that fund.
I would be supportive of that.
Yeah, I would be too. And any other places that we can look to sort of ease the burden on people, especially human resources.
Miriam?
I would like us to talk about the 0.2 RIF from sustainability. Obviously I'm not comfortable with any of these cuts. I'd be concerned if any of us were. It's not like fun. But I just don't see how that specific cut makes sense. I understand that cuts and letting go of employees in any way is going to be painful, but it doesn't feel like a logical or strategic cut to cut 0.2 when we know that we're going to lose the employee. So I want to ask that we look for other sources for RIFs if we need to, or cuts, or at least that we discuss it. I'm always skeptical when I hear this is just how it has to be. I know it's going to be painful either way, but I just feel like it would be.
Scott?
Yeah, I appreciate that sentiment, and I agree. Libby, you say that you're going to have to make those cuts eventually, but that is in itself an assumption you are making. And so I just want to be careful. We have the most information about this budget that we're building, and we have less and less information about going further out. And so the confidence level in projections out into the future is lower. And so, yeah, I have to agree with what was just articulated. And I really like what Jake brought back up, and I think Mia, you were originally the person to say it, and I wish I had said this at the time, but if I remember correctly, that like changing what we withdraw from the fund balance is really just a trick of accounting, because if we don't spend it, it just goes back into the fund balance, right? And so there's no downside to saying that we're going to increase what we're withdrawing to get up to that 10%. But if we don't ever use it, then it all goes back into the fund and we have it for future years. And so I just don't see any reason not to use that mechanism to get the increase year over year closer to 9.5 or so. I think we're leaving money on the table by only going to what I don't have it in front of me right now, but would you say it was 8.46 or 8.64? So
8.48.
48. Thank you.
Yeah.
I definitely understand what you're saying, Miriam, and I understand what Scott is saying. I disagree about the idea of leaving money on the table, and I think that one of the values of having the new line chart where they go up every year for us tonight is to see that anytime, as any amount that we bump up FY25, if we didn't change anything else about the assumptions that we've put in place, all those lines increase, except for the green one, because it's capped. And I think the real challenge for us as board members is that we have to make system-wide decisions when there are real human beings involved in the system, but we still have to make system-wide decisions. I took the opportunity to have coffee with a former board member who, to just see, like, what would you do if you were still sitting in this seat? And she shared with me that when she joined the board, an iteration of the board before her had avoided making cuts to personnel because they cared so much about the people who were filling those roles, which I completely and totally understand. But because they had avoided making those cuts, there was nearly no money for facilities. There was nearly no money for supplies. And the board that she was on had to build back up a budget that invested in the buildings that our children were going to school in and our teachers were teaching in. And so I don't think it is right of us to avoid the very difficult decisions that have, yes, human beings behind them, without considering that there are human beings in our facilities, and there are human beings in transportation, and there are human beings in the tax rate. And so I feel comfortable with this budget where it is, given as difficult as it is.
Yeah, no, I want to second that too. I definitely respect the desire to protect people, and I think that's something we need to do and need to give a lot of thought to. But we're gonna have to make tough choices, and this year might be the easiest of the tough choices the next 2 or 3 that we have. Not making tough choices now are going to make the choices tougher next year and tougher the year beyond that. And I also really feel confident that Libby and Christina and the leadership team have thought hard about both this year and the outlook years. And, you know, the questions I've asked about impacts to our goals, to the education of students, have all been answered, at least for me, satisfactory, that these are, you know, strategic cuts that make sense now, that don't interfere with longer term goals, even if they do unfortunately have impacts on people. And I think Mia was very right that all our choices are going to have impacts on people, whether it's going to be unfortunately, people's jobs. It's going to be people's ability to afford staying in their house, with tax rates. It's going to be decisions about how our kids get to school. So we have a lot of tough choices, and I actually feel this current budget is a very well balanced first start. And no, we don't know we don't have we have lower confidence as it goes out, but we do know that without, I think, pretty unrealistic changes, we are going to have to continue to be strategic about our cuts, and delaying choices is not going to make it easier for future boards who are going to be in this position next year. Emma?
Yeah, I mean, one of the depressing things about considering the next 5 years is like, the reduction in force represents about 3 FTEs. And I just don't see how that's sustainable over the next 5 years. Like, I can't picture cutting 3 FTEs every year for the next 5 years. I just can't picture how that will work in maintaining high quality education for the students. And yeah, I'm just going to reiterate my stance is I feel like a 0.2 FTE represents about $25,000 maybe to $35,000, and that just feels like such a small drop in the bucket when it would allow this one person a whole nother year. We can consider cutting it next year, but a whole nother year to do like life planning around a career change. And I think that would be in line with the values of how we value staff and the student experience. And I haven't heard for all of these other positions, it sort of like resonates and makes sense about like, there's low enrollment, and even the library media specialist, the principal spoke to that it's not really functioning that way. And for this particular position, there hasn't been a clear explanation to me anyway, maybe in your meetings, around like why it's going to be valuable to cut that, like how that, why that's a good choice, that particular position. It just seems like if you have a person in the building for 0.2 FTEs more, that can only support students. And I'm not saying that it doesn't, that it shouldn't be done. But I just think postponing it another year would give that person more time to plan that life change. So that's the last I'll talk about it.
So there is a person behind the K-6 licensure cut. As of right now, it's the last person hired.
Right.
There is a person behind the library media person cut as well, who was hired quite a while ago. If you're looking at the board's focus of academic achievement for all, then you should be looking at the RVS pre-K, because pre-K education is possibly the most important education years of a child's life, as research shows. Mm-hmm. So I think that the board, if the board wants to, as a vote, wants to put some of these RIFs back into place, I think you need to be honest with yourselves about why you're doing it, and it needs to connect to your values and the focus of the board. Mm-hmm. And so there is a person behind 3 of those RIFs that is currently in a staffing position at Montpelier-Roxbury.
Yeah.
So to say just one is more important than others doesn't feel right to me. But okay. And then the Roxbury pre-K position, while we have low enrollment and it's hard to hire for, which were the reasons why it's on this list. It's what hurts that it's on this list is because pre-K is so unbelievably important in a child's life, right? So that would have to be considered as well, right? When you're getting there. So then you're down to 1 FTE RIF that doesn't have a person in it and probably isn't connected a whole lot to student achievement or student experience. So now we're above the 10%. Without doing other things.
If we put all the positions back in that had people attached to them.
Or that were attached to the board's focus and values.
Right.
And academic achievement. So then you're back up over the 10%. And so then we'd in the matter of the next 2 weeks, we'd be looking at what else could we do? Or what else should we do? Should we add more of the fund balance in? Should we cut more facilities? That's a lot of thinking in the next 2 weeks before we have to warn this meeting. So I would just ask the board to really think about what you say your values are, what you say your focus is, and be thinking about that there are 3 positions in there that have people behind them, not 1, but 3.
I really appreciate you bringing up the RDS pre-K position. I know that we have a small number of families. I think you said it was 4. But when I do think, and I think maybe it was 3 of those families that actually said that the part-time day program wouldn't work. So
Right.
are we talking about 1? Possibly. But I certainly think about what, if those families' circumstances change and the half-day program does become of value, I think what Roxbury families are facing is the plight of getting on a waiting list at a neighboring community preschool that is 1 to 2 to 3+ miles long. And I think I brought this up at 2 meetings ago too, that, being in education, 0 to 5 equates to success as an adult. It is not to be underestimated. So I really appreciate you bringing up, the potential value of plugging that position back in for, Roxbury in particular. Last year, I think families were starting to get into scramble of where they might go, and calls were being made to Northfield. Yep, you're 20th on the list, and you're way down the list because you're coming from another town. So, when a Roxbury family gets on a list in another town, you're behind everybody else who's already in that town because we're not taxpayers in that community. So it's a significant impact when, we don't have a pre-K program. Again, I understand demand is essential, but I just want to echo absolutely what Libby said, that the pre-K piece it's just essential for the trajectory of kids over the long term.
Jill?
Thanks. I just had 2 quick questions. One, Libby, were you just saying that the RIF positions, if they were included in the budget, it would push us over the 10%?
Yeah. We would be right at 10%.
And I don't see the presentation anymore. Is the pre-K position in Roxbury that you guys are talking about currently a RIF or currently in the budget? I'm sorry, I don't know where it goes.
Currently, we're suggesting it's a RIF for next year's budget.
I see. Okay, thank you.
But it's not
filled.
It's not
Is that-
filled right now. It's in our budget for FY24. It's just not filled. We couldn't find a teacher for it.
Thank you.
I just want to ask Jill's question again, make sure I'm hearing it right. So if we are to reintroduce 1 RIF, then we exceed the 10% or all?
Add it up.
If you add them all up
yeah.
together, it brings us to, it
Yeah.
exceeds the 10%. Okay, thank you.
This would be a good time to go to the public.
Yeah, I just want
I just want to make one more request, just in terms of the projections chart. If we could add Roxbury in, if that formula is, I imagine, pretty straightforward. I just think if community members, this is sort of like our standing record, and if community members go looking, it's there for Montpelier, but it's not for Roxbury. And I would love to be able to point to folks, if they have questions about how that will impact, and again, their guesses, their hypotheticals, but so that Roxbury folks could see that for themselves.
I guess you could just say, assuming it does a 3% drop every year. I don't know.
I think it would be similar.
You talking about this one?
No, I'm talking about the one with the green, yes, what Mia has.
Page 35.
Yeah. So at the bottom, it shows kind of what the CLA changes,
Montpelier.
yeah, kind of the post-residential tax rate with the CLA introduced for Montpelier, but it doesn't show it for Roxbury. And I just think it would be good for folks to be able to see that in Roxbury too.
Should be very similar.
What's that?
It would be very similar.
It would be very similar.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
Roxbury CLA probably moves similarly, but a little bit more bouncy. But it should be basically the same story overall.
Okay. I mean, could we just write then same for Roxbury or whatever it needs to be, but just, I think it would be helpful in our community just to point people, this is what's out there in the public budget forum, and how does it look for Roxbury?
Scott has his hand up, but I don't know if you guys can see it.
Yeah. Thank you, Jill.
Just thank you, Jill. Libby, I just have a quick question about retirements. I feel like a couple of meetings ago, you had mentioned, there were some discussions going on about potential, like retirement buyouts or whatnot. And I'm curious if you have any information about potential retirement. And I can't remember, but I thought there was like a conversation with the teachers union, but nothing had been agreed upon yet. And so I'm curious if there's any information about those.
The
Thank you.
retirement buyout offer has gone out to two of our unions, to the MREA, which is our teachers union, our professional staff, and AFSCME, which is support staff, custodians, technological people, and administrative assistants. And we have one AFSCME member who has taken advantage of the retirement offer, and we have had no MREA members as of yet, but I think the deadline is still, I'm looking at Joe, the deadline's like January 15th or something like that, yeah. So if people are still considering it, they have time to consider it.
Awesome. Thank you.
So let's open it up to the public. Start with the room first. I know there's someone from Roxbury who's like they've had their hand up for a while. So I'm going to start with the room and then we can go online if anyone wants to open up the room. Joe?
Sorry. Joe Carroll, MREA president. It's a process question. I'm hoping for clarity on the January 17th meeting. Is there going to be another presentation like this and then y'all take the vote and then it heads to town meeting, or is tonight sort of that night and the last opportunity for advocacy and discussion and things of that sort? And I know I'm asking a question as a statement, but
yeah,
I hope you'll grant me.
It's a good question, Joe.
I think we'll probably do just a quick overview of the budget and especially if there's any changes, either changes in numbers, seems like our what used to be utilized pupil rate keeps changing a little.
It's typically just the graph of the budget.
And we'll have public comment. So, before I take a vote, if there's, last opportunity to weigh in before we do pass it, and then it will move to the town hall. So, so that will be the process.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else in the room? Nathan?
Nathan Suter, Montpelier resident and parent of two kids. Thank you all very much. I'm fascinated by this page, which is the assumptions page. And it sounds, I'm trying to understand the dollar yield even further. Maybe Jake and I can have like a 2-day tutorial. So I was trying to find a historic trend for what has happened with the dollar yield over the last, say, 6 years in Vermont, and I'm finding that a little inscrutable. I agree that going down $1,000 a year is unlikely for 5 years, so it'd be down to like $4,000 or something like that. So maybe if we were to moderate that row of your assumptions, this would look a little less scary. I think that statewide there would be riots. But the other thing I found that was interesting, and let me get to it, is one of the effects of Act 127, according to the Joint Fiscal Office 2023 report on Vermont's education financing, is that Act 127 also required the JFO to examine the inclusion of a constitutionally adequate education spending amount for school districts at a level that is determined by education funding experts to be sufficient to meet student needs. The JFO goes on to say things like that's above our pay grade and stuff like that. But it strikes me that these assumptions and the tax impact that Emma articulated as quite scary 5 years from now bends a lot on a political decision in the legislature and in perhaps the executive branch in terms of what they're willing to say the dollar yield is to support adequate education spending for school districts at a level that is determined by education funding experts to be sufficient to meet student needs. So I think that the problem or the challenge is not in this room, right? The challenge is a statewide political challenge. And As a parent of two kids who I wish to be educated and younger kids who are neighbors who I wish to be educated, it makes me really angry that this district, the school board and our staff are being squeezed by probably a lack of political courage to sort of make a stronger commitment to education in Vermont. So that's my desire. I don't expect you to be able to change it, but I stand with you and I'm happy to write legislators and organize and activate around that. So good luck.
Thank you. Yes.
I would like to just say something about, Libby had brought up the importance of preschool programs for young children in that area of development. And Kristen had also mentioned how local schools are I have long waiting lists for preschools. Is there any way that the preschool in Roxbury could become a tuition supported preschool from anybody in any town? And
It already is.
is it? Okay,
So,
but could we, is that something you could
so
spread that word around so people might fill it up and increase income?
So under Act 166, which is the pre-K legislation, school districts are required for residents, children
Yeah.
of pre-K age to pay tuition for, I think it's up to 10 hours of pre-K services, and they can take that money wherever they want.
Okay. But do you think that residents who are in other towns who are on long waiting lists know that?
Yeah.
Okay,
I think so.
because it just seems like that's a group that's getting pushed out of the openings that exist. And it would be a full preschool classroom would do a lot more than 4 or 5 kids. And as you know, I was the preschool teacher there in Roxbury, and it's very dear to my heart to see kids have that opportunity.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Online, please use the raise hand function, or you can go off camera and just wave physically. Also have John from Roxbury. He's been patiently with his hand up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Jim. This is John Guifrey from Roxbury. Used to be the school board chair there, as well as now the select board chair here in our town. I raised my hand when you guys were having the CLA discussion, just as a point of clarification. So while towns and cities do their assessments 6 to 10 years apart, the CLA is based on sales to assessed home values, and when those are out of whack, particularly I think the level is 82%, but someone might know that number better. When it drops below that, that triggers an automatic reassessment of the properties. So the 3% that's proposed in the budget is probably a likely scenario in rising property values over that period of time in a large property base. So anyways, but that's not really why I wanted to talk. I'll try to keep this brief. My hope is that I can provide a perspective to this discussion that is out of the weeds, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on any of the weeds of the budget, but rather now removed from your situation and your position, to urge you guys to take a look at this from a perspective that I do know that you have been, but much to the same sentiments as Mr. Suter, I think, who just spoke, that this is not really a discussion that is fair to you as board members. Nobody, I don't think I've ever come across a select board or a school board who's spending money willy-nilly, nor do we have lots of extra cash flowing around through our coffers to do this. And you guys as a board are being put in an untenable situation. you're being asked to evaluate two untenable scenarios. One, cutting money that cannot be cut out of a budget and still function. And two, spending tax rate dollars that are insane and also are untenable for the residents, whether they have children or not in the school. So this isn't being done by our school board. This isn't being done by our community. This is being done by the constant multi-decade tinkering of the state trying to figure out their perpetual problem, which is lack of tax revenue. So that is not a problem you guys can solve without destroying the school system. You know, the assumptions of saying that, Jim, you were talking about, you know, in year 5, if we try to get there slowly, it's going to be better when we get to FY30. That's the assumption that this is going to stay the same. And I find it entirely impossible that the people of our state will put up with what is going on right now with regards to how this is going to affect school systems. And we're just seeing the first round of it this year, and people are going to go ballistic. And that is what forces them to go back to the drawing board and do something yet again. And it will likely be bad, just like this was and all the other previous attempts at trying to fix this. But I urge you not to start cutting things out of a system that can't be cut out of there. Because think about what would happen if 15 or 20 people and families left the district. We don't have large numbers. It will make things worse. And what do people do when they're committed to having good educations for their children and the school system is underfunded, underperforming, doesn't have money for facilities, teachers are being riffed 3 a year? It's an untenable situation. So I would urge you to keep moving forward with, you know, consistent and prudent budgetary decisions with regards to your staff and maintaining the programs, because we don't have any sloshing around in there. And we need to keep our schools functioning the way they are, because without that, it is the first way to sewer your community and have people start moving out of your community to go elsewhere, either to a different town or city in our state where the schools aren't impacted as much, or to move completely out of the state entirely, which hurts us doubly. So in standing up to the position that you guys are being put in, it sends a message to the legislature that this is not okay and it needs to change. And everyone who's listening here and can talk to their friends, they have to be the ones that go talk to the legislators as well and say, you guys goofed, you need to fix this, and you need to change it fast, because we're being put in a position to hurt our school system because you guys wanted us to mess around with proportions and percentages, and it's not okay. So I'm sorry you guys are really having to deal with this. It's not fair to you, and I thank you for all your efforts and what you're trying to do, but I do urge you to try to maintain what we have right now until the citizenry of our cities, our towns, and our state can tell them, back to the drawing board, guys, this isn't going to work. Thanks.
Hey, John. Anyone else on the line? Going once. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I just want to kind of return it to further board discussion on this. I do want to echo some of the comments that came, I think, from, you know, Emma, John, and Nathan, certainly about the need for a state fix. And I know it might be slightly appropriate for a board chair to call for it, but I think it's really time for our legislators to re-examine this act. And I think even if they do, it will mean some, you know, it will mean that, you know, just given, I think what's a needed change in how we account for people's, well, I think will mean a higher tax burden for this community. But I think the way the law is currently structured is not manageable. But I think the administration, the board have done a really good job thus far in putting together a responsible first year budget that shows we are willing to, I think, play a part in a redistribution of state funds to ensure that students meet their needs, but the wacky impacts of this law are not sustainable. And I think for this board, the course is to, at least in my opinion, to deal with the situation we have, try to make the cuts as unharmful as they can be to our education mission, which I think this budget at least achieves in year one. Whether we'd be able to achieve that in year 4, 5, or 2030 without a change, I think is a very different question. But yeah, I absolutely agree that this community is willing to, I think, bear a little more to ensure that districts that have historically probably been underfunded are better funded by the state. But I plead to the legislature to do a lot of work this session to find a better way to achieve that goal. So I'll stop there and reopen it up to folks. Jake?
I think that, it's certainly hard stuff, this year, but, I'm proud that, that we are willing to not maximize short-term at the expense of long-term. A lot of elected officials, I think, are just keep on maximizing short-term at the expense of long-term, and it's irresponsible. It's harder to do it this way, but I think it's the right thing to do. So I'm glad that we're doing it.
Typically, we have an invitation out to our legislators to come to us while they're in session. Do we have that on the agenda planning document, or do we have a date for that?
We have not set a date for that. Libby, Mia, and I have met with, I think, pretty much all of the
Almost
all of it. Yeah, there was a couple who, or at least one who couldn't make it. I think we delivered a powerful message, and I think it was well received. That said, I think hearing from as many people as possible is important. I think words is starting to get out there. I think it was a little slow at first, but we will invite the legislators to come. We haven't gotten to it yet. We've just been trying to get through this process, but hopefully for sometime in February we can reach out and get them on the agenda. And obviously the legislature session was fast, so I'll try to get that out this week.
Could you just touch on the, it's come up in a couple of meetings, the effect that a depleted ed fund has on something?
Value.
How does that, can you sort of say something to it, just so that I can try to help it stick to my brain maybe better?
So, and Nathan was curious about this too. The yield is kind of the magical number that makes the ed fund work. It came out of Act 46, but really it comes out of Act 60. It's like you have all these districts with tax rates based on per pupil spending, and you also know their grand lists, and you somehow magically have to plug in a number that's the denominator to make the ed fund fill up appropriately. That's the yield. So when times are tough in the ed fund, it puts pressure on tax rates, and so the yield goes down. And since it's the denominator, if that denominator is going down, that drives tax rates up. When times are good, the yield goes up, and times going up, times being good includes property appreciating. So in the past couple of years, you may have noticed the yield go up by 1,000 or even 2,000.
Yeah, it's gone up for as long as I've been superintendent.
Right, and that's because of real estate appreciating pretty rapidly. So I think those things are going to kind of counteract each other. There's going to be a lot of pressure in the ed fund, but real estate is probably going to continue to appreciate. So the yield who knows? It might go down a little bit like we were looking at here. It might be level. But that's the yield.
Did that help?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I've heard it. It's just, sort of thinking about the ed fund being depleted over the next 5 years as the state covers this above, everything above that 5% cap. And that's not a usual pressure, I would imagine, on the ed fund. So it changes the dynamics of the whole equation.
That is why I'm so cognizant of saying the assumption slides are guesses. Because we're in a different world. I know Emma wrote an email and said, well, what's the average thing that the yield does? And like, it's not there. And, I could tell you that on average, it goes up a few $100s to on a really good year, $1,000. I think that happened like 2 years ago or something. And we were like throwing parties the day we got that yield letter. But that historical average of what the yield has done is not something we can look at right now because we're in such new territory by just what you just said, Brett, that the ed fund has a pressure on it that it previously hasn't had.
Yeah, and I kind of want to go to, I think something John was touching on. I mean, just there's a real cyclical relationship between how good our schools are and our property values. I mean, if this is not a town that families want to move to because they don't believe in our schools, we're not going to get those buyers coming in, and we're not going to get their dollars. And also, the more people who come into our community, it increases our student yield. It's also, most families who have kids are the families that do not benefit from things like income adjusted property taxes. And income adjusted property taxes is great in that it helps a lot of people, stay in their homes past retirement, but it also means that there's a lot of revenue that's being lost when you have an aging population and you don't have, younger families moving in who are paying the full amount of the revenue, which drives those numbers, further down. So, I just want to put a plug that, investing in our schools, it's not a drain. It is the engine oftentimes of how our communities function, not just in terms of educating our kids, but economically as well, and just keeping towns vibrant, keeping revenue coming in, keeping the type of things that we know and love about both Montpelier and Roxbury. Miriam?
I've had a minute to think about this now, and I still feel that it's my responsibility to the students that I'm here to represent to point out that the cut that I was discussing earlier is not the most strategic way to get to our budget requirements. However, the more I think about this and the more we discuss it, it's just such an impossible situation. And the more I think about it, the less I understand how we can make this work. And I have so much appreciation for the people who are running those numbers and trying to figure out how we can make this work. And so I respect the decision that we're coming to on the topic. And I really hope we can make this work.
Libby, do you feel like you have enough guidance from what you've heard around using more or less fund balance and the reduction in force stuff?
I think the fund balance is a question I still have. I heard a couple different things.
For moving closer to, if we're at 8.5, what portion of the fund balance can we move back to get to 9.5? If that's a comfortable enough place, given the unknowns. If a half a percentage point, is that not enough? Even if it's, what's a half a percentage of the fund balance going back?
I think if we move that 165,000, we'd be around 9.5.
if I may say, the training that Libby and I went to a couple weeks ago with the superintendents and business managers, we talked about if everybody gets close to 10%, that it might have a negative impact on the yield. So it might be kicking the can down the road a little bit. Reports. Yes.
There's a part of me that feels like in this scenario, kicking the can down the road is not a bad plan because this seems like a really untenable can. And that it probably will.
Maybe a nuclear can.
It feels like it's likely to change. It just doesn't seem like people are going to be able to shoulder that burden in 2030 if it keeps going down this road. So that's sort of where I stand. I think getting closer to 9.5 by pulling back on the fund balance and by adding that 0.2 back in, that would be my hope.
Which 0.2?
The sustainability position. Or if you discuss with your team and decide that it's the Roxbury pre-K, or any, if you decide, 0.5 is bigger than 0.2, so that's like a bigger difference. 1.0 is bigger than 0.2, so that's a bigger difference. But I would trust you and your team to make the decision. But I think lessening the burden on RIFs as much as possible to get to 9.5.
I'm hearing mixed things about what we want to see. Can I just do a quick, how many people are comfortable with the budget the way it is and want to see it presented as is next meeting?
Wait, can we vote for more things than one? Or just one thing? How are you holding the straw poll here?
Well, let's talk a little, I guess we have kind of three options. We have budget as is.
Yep.
I actually maybe four options. Budget with some of the RIFs put back in to get closer to 9.5. Budget with more reserve fund put back in to get closer to low 9.5.
Yeah.
Or budget with a combination of both of those things put in to get back to get closer to 9.5 or 9.25. So you could be comfortable with more than one. You could be, I'd be okay as is, or with some reserve fund put back
Can we
in.
do ranked choice vote? I'm just kidding.
I'm not,
I think those are our four choices for next time.
Jill's got it.
Jill.
I'm really sorry. I feel brain dead. So if we put more fund balance, it gets us closer to the 10, wouldn't it?
No.
The other way.
The other way.
So,
Pull fund balance back out for a rainy day is what I mean.
Put it back in the savings account.
Put it back in the savings account to use later to get closer to this year. So that way we have more in future years.
So adjusting the current plan that's currently on the table by reducing the fund balance that's put into that one this year. So that we have that money in future years. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. And I think that would mean.
That's a good clarification, Jill. Thank you.
Yes.
And that means getting closer to the 10%.
It means getting closer to 10%. But I think as Scott pointed out last time, that's kind of like one-time money. Do we want to use it do we want to have more money for a bigger bang, one-time bang later? Or do we want to kind of gradually do it to make the glide path a little smoother?
Libby, you had said at a previous meeting that you wanted to keep enough of a distance from 10 to make sure we didn't go over. So, and I think it was more than 0.5. So I'm just wondering what you're comfortable with around that.
Good question, Lynn. Thank you.
It is a good question and it's an unknown because what Christina just said is advice that we have been given, that the more districts who are close to 10%, more districts like us who are close to that 10% number, will pull more from the ed fund, which sounded at that time to be unexpected, that districts would be close to the 10% by government officials. And so if that's the case, they told us there was a possibility that in May, the dollar yield would be different than what we are now. I don't remember that ever happening before, other than in a positive direction.
But we haven't had like a year like this before.
Yeah, but we're in new territory again. So I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know if that's a scare tactic. I don't know what that was, but Christine and I did hear that same advice.
Also increases what the ed funds would have to pick up because we're at the cap. So we have to think kind of statewide too. That looks like for the ed fund.
Yeah. So we want to give ourselves room. Does the dollar yield impact that? I'm drawing a mind blank right now.
It gets set.
I know, but will it impact our per pupil equalized amount? I forget my.
No, it comes in after.
It comes in after it.
It's locked.
Yeah, it comes in after it.
Is the effect of Act 127 sort of balance out overall, as in like there's sort of an equal number of districts that are disadvantaged, or sort of equivalent amount of districts that are disadvantaged as opposed to those that are advantaged? Or is it skewed in either direction? The idea that we're essentially, this district is essentially disadvantaged by this new formula. There are a handful of other districts, at least that I've heard of in the state, that are also disadvantaged. Is it relatively even, the number of districts that are disadvantaged as we are, compared to the districts that?
They told us that, right? And I'm scratching my brain to feel like, because they told us.
Because if it's
Do
a
you know off the top of your
small,
head?
Yeah, it was, so in the original modeling by the Joint Fiscal Office, it was 50-50-ish. This year, at least so far, it's kind of like leaning more towards more districts being disadvantaged and being capped at the 5%, at least now. That might change as time goes on. But generally, like what's going on statewide is like what I would call Vermont suburban. And this is my own term for it, but like Montpelier, Champlain Valley, Essex, Norwich, pretty severely disadvantaged by design. And then the more urban districts that have a lot of English language, multilingual learners, multilingual learners, and students in poverty are greatly advantaged. And also rural districts, they have a new weight for rural areas and small schools within rural areas. So those are the more advantaged districts. So like we're losing capacity, but there are lots of districts which are gaining a lot of tax capacity right now around the state. So, you know, it's all by design.
But, you know, I was making dinner last night and the soup was in one of the other disadvantaged districts in Jake's suburban Vermont. And she was like, this is whack. I don't know how we're gonna get through this budget season. This is the wackiest thing I've ever, like, her board is feeling very similar to you all. And I think.
This is super in a small rural.
No, in a suburban district in the Champlain Valley. And she was like, and she's feeling very similar to how I'm feeling about it too. So like, you're not alone. I know that doesn't make you feel any better, but.
Well, and the reason why I ask is because if there's a critical mass of people that are moving towards that 10%, that are getting close to it, then makes me less wanting to go towards it, essentially. If it's a smaller group, that's sort of disadvantaged, then I'm less concerned that we're close to the 10% in a sense, which is all very theoretical, but
it is very
that does
theoretical.
inform my.
However, the people who are most likely to be near that 10% are also the districts that have a very large student population relative to ours and a much higher budget. And so when they're going closer to 10%, they're capped at 5%. And they're going to be a lot bigger. Their budget's double ours, triple ours. So it's those are the districts that Jake is kind of talking about. You know, Essex Westford's budget is triple ours. Champlain Valley is probably quadruple ours. And those are the districts that are.
So to fill in the blank there, or to complete your sentence, I think, to backfill from the ed fund, to their budget is a lot more money than to
Than our
backfill
budget. Yeah.
our budget, right?
And can somebody remind me, through our budget discussion for fund balance, didn't we like initially we were assuming we wouldn't use any of it, and then we wanted to.
We had always known that we were gonna use 400,000. That's been in play and
Long term.
yeah, that's been just a plan that we typically use $400,000 of our fund balance over the last, I don't know, 5 years. We've done that almost every year I've been here. And so this year it's up to 568 or something like that.
But if I recall correctly, FY 25 was the last year of that
Yes.
plan. So if for FY 26 and FY 27, we would be like right now for FY 25, our plan is to use 565,000. But if we put that 165 back into the fund balance and didn't use it, then there's 165,000 more for 26, 27, 28. And to me, it seems kind of significant that it wasn't part of our long-term plan yet for FY 26 on to use fund balance, because it feels like it makes it even more valuable that it's there to be able to use it, given the charts that we've been looking at.
I think the other piece is, if we put pressure on the fund balance, we as a big group, it maybe puts pressure on the legislators to.
You mean on the education?
I mean,
fund?
yeah, sorry, I misspoke. The education fund, it puts more pressure on the legislators to really rethink what's happening here. I mean, they're going to have to deal with it.
It clearly paints the picture of the impact of the legislation that they've enacted. So in some ways, it's like, here you go.
Back to the straw poll, my vote is to give Libby as much flexibility as possible and not to put like a number 9.5%, but closer to increase. And my vote would be a mix of both fund balance and reduction in force to get closer to 9.5.
I'm against the 0.5 pre-K position altogether. So if you wanted to, I would go for a 1.0 there. Otherwise, nobody's going to go. And that's a horrible program. That is a shame. And I don't know if a 1.0 would actually bring in revenue. Who knows? There's a lot of need for childcare and a working class community like mine and the surrounding communities. And those are the values of the surrounding communities that, pre-K, after school programming, like helping people work so that they can put money on the table. That's what people need in my neck of the woods.
Which of the options were you voting
Well, no, not, yeah, 1.0 pre-K. No, it's not that. I'm just for moving towards 9.5. I don't know what to say about how it's done.
Okay.
Lynn?
I'm for moving toward 10, wherever that ends up, with Libby's thoughts about a safe margin there, and taking money from the fund balance.
So just so I'm clear, I've got moving towards 9.5, mix of.
Yes, got the list right here. I'm just counting votes right now. We've
Kristen.
got one, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Second.
Okay.
Second, Lynn.
Easy. Put it in the same column. So moving toward 9.5 and putting more money back into the fund balance to get there.
Doing a little bit, Jill and Scott.
Scott and Jill, or Jill and Scott, however you want to go.
Sorry, I know I live in the world of math, but I'm really struggling. So when people are saying move fund balance to get closer to 9.5, they're saying don't buy down our budget with our fund balance.
Yes.
They're saying leave more money in the fund balance, which will then, okay. I'm for that. That's fine. I'm pretty go with the flow, but that makes sense to me if that's the will of the board.
Scott went away.
Disappeared. Oh, I bet he tried to unmute himself.
Yep, probably tried to unmute himself.
Okay, we'll come back to Scott. Jake.
Fund balance.
Mia.
Fund balance.
Scott, you're back.
Or stay as is. That's why I wanted ranked choice voting,
Yeah.
but I knew that would get too
Yeah.
complicated at 8:15 at night.
Yeah. Scott. Can you hear me? Can I hear you? I can't hear you, but can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. You can hear two of you now. Or at least see two of you.
I love it.
Let's get 2 votes.
I'm with you, Mia. I would, if I was ranked choice, I'm leave it as is or fund balance. If that's helpful.
All right. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think it goes without saying that I think it's irresponsible for us to do anything other than get up to 9.5 or higher.
And how would you like to do that? Leave it up to Libby, fund balance.
I think I trust Libby.
All right. And I think I'm in the Mia Jill camp of either as is or fund balance, which I think the winner seems to be fund balance.
Yeah, and I'm also hearing most board members say, let's try to get closer to 9.5.
Yeah. Using fund balance.
Right.
Using a reduction or using the fund balance.
Right.
To get there.
Okay, we can show you that.
Till next week.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, thanks, Christina.
She's like, I'm gonna go crush some more numbers for y'all. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Christina. So we will see that budget next week, and we will
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Don't forget, we haven't.
2 weeks.
Don't do that to me.
We're not
Jim.
doing the every week anymore.
Don't do that.
And
Jim.
I know you guys don't have votes, but let's hear from the students as well.
It's a straw poll.
It's a straw poll. The debate to exclude you, but
I have just been listening, and at first I had some, I think, opposing opinions, but what Mia said kind of put it into perspective about, thinking about the future and every single student that's under these facilities, and that's kind of made me not completely reevaluate what I think, but it's kind of, I guess, made me think more adult, I think. So I'm just trying to deal with that reevaluation in my head tonight. Yeah.
That's real.
And to be clear, to reevaluate your thinking is a very impressive thing to do that many adults can't.
Pretty mature.
Laura and I have the same opinion on this. I'm deeply uncomfortable with all of it because I know that I and my friends will have to live with all the consequences of this, and I know that we as a board will have to live with that as well, but that means making tough choices as well, I suppose.
Jill's got her hand up.
Jill.
Just real quick, I don't want to throw a wrench in the works, but I remember at one point, because we had a healthy fund balance, we were worried that would get clawed back. I'm feeling like we made it through that gauntlet okay in the last few years. So there isn't a risk that if we're really good about keeping our fund balance for the next 5 years, that could be somehow clawed back to the ed fund or used against us in any way, right? I mean, I feel like that's part of why we wanted to sort of encumber it, is because we didn't want it to get taken away. Sorry. And I can only see Libby's reaction. So I want to,
My reaction was the same as Jake's, almost at the exact same time.
just another unknown, but hopefully not.
It gets threatened occasionally, mostly by the governor, I would say. But I haven't heard anything about that lately. I will tell you in all honesty, that would take the Agency of Education having a pretty well-versed idea of what our fund balance is, and I can't see that happening anytime in the near future. And so I personally am not very worried about that. I think that a response from legislators who are more worldly, to critiques of this law could be twofold. One could be our class sizes in Vermont are very small. Let's make them bigger. And I didn't say that's a Libby thing. I'd say that that could be a response to critiques of 127. And another thing people could say is you have a flush fund balance, use it. And so it would just be more of a suggestion, a strong suggestion to use it. I could see that happening, which sounds like it's part of the strategy. It has to be part of our strategy going forward anyway. So, so yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, thanks.
Well, they can't torture us. You know, if they're gonna create a cliff after 5 years, they can't also take our funds.
Right.
That's cruel and
I
unusual.
was like, that would be just
Yeah, it would be mean.
putting salt in the wound a little bit.
Yeah.
I was thinking the exact same thing. Okay, we'll
No.
get closer to 9.5%.
Okay.
Great. So we'll see that next week. Thank everyone for the hard work and great thought on this. We're not done yet, but I think we're closer. Final order of business before we adjourn, policy monitoring report. We have B8, electronic communication between employees and students. Do I have a motion to approve the B8 monitoring report?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Boy, I got a lot. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great.
Aye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.